Everyone knows the Salvation Army. It's at work all over the world, wherever human need is greatest. Above all, it proclaims salvation through the blood of Christ and the fire of the Holy Spirit. And it calls the world to hear its message by music and marching. This was where it all began, almost a century ago in the East End of London, with the preaching of the founder of the Salvation Army, William Booth. In 1865, he took his stand here on the Mile End Waste, near a tavern called the Vine. He preached with the experience of years, though he at first was diffident about his own powers.
I feared my ability to deal with people as completely outside the Christian circle as the heathen of foreign lands. But I had forgotten my work in Nottingham when I was a boy of 16, 20 years before.
In Nottingham, 50,000 people lived in houses built for 10,000, mostly working in the stocking industry. William Booth was baptized in Snainton Church, close by Nottington Place, where he was born in 1829. His father, a speculative builder, had been well off, and his house was pleasant enough. But behind it were the tenements of the framework knitters. Day and night the boy could hear the clack of the knitting machines, when there was work for them, for the 1840s were years of great distress.
From my earliest days I was thrown into close association with poverty in its lowest depths. The children in the streets weeping for food, the degradation and misery of the poor stockingers, kindled in my heart yearnings to help the poor, which have had a powerful influence on my life.
William was 13 when his family began to know real poverty themselves. His father died a ruined man, and his son went out to work. Poor himself, William was now thrust into the very heart of Nottingham's poverty, for he was apprenticed to a pawnbroker. It was in these years of what he called his blighted childhood that God took charge of William's life. There had always been good influences around him. His mother, Mary Booth, was one, but she had not encouraged her son in religion. It was friends who had taken him to Wesley Chapel in Broad Street, where he heard the preaching of Isaac Marsden of Doncaster.
I shall never forget the first words I heard from him. We entered the chapel late in the dusk. I could hardly see the speaker, but just at that moment he was saying, "A soul dies every minute." I was at that time without any experience of religion, but I felt it was better to live right than to live wrong, pleasing God and spending my powers to get others into such a life. But entrance to the kingdom was closed by an evil act of mine that required restitution. I remember as if it were yesterday, kneeling in the room under the chapel, the resolution, the finding of the boy I had wronged, the acknowledgement of my sin, and the peace that came after. I felt I could travel to the ends of the earth for Jesus Christ, and to suffer anything to help the souls of other men.
He was to suffer and travel the world one day. But at first it was in the poor streets of his native Nottingham that he went to gospel meetings. In Kidd Street he was persuaded to preach standing on a borrowed chair. Kidd Street has long since gone, but his words might well have echoed down Loudham Street.
All the suffering and sorrow in the world comes from sin. Friends, I want to put a few straight questions. Have any of you got a child at home without shoes? Are your wives waiting in the dark for you to return without money? Are you going to spend in drink money that your wives need for food and your children for shoes? Friends, it was for you Christ died. Stop and be saved.
When he was 20, he had to go to London to find work. In the crowded streets, he only found loneliness, and for employment once again a pawnbroker's in the Walworth Road.
It was work, 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 morning, noon and night. I was allowed my liberty on the Sabbath and one night a week, but then back by 10 or the door would be locked. I travelled long distances preaching the gospel, and many a Sunday night, to get back in time, I had to hasten till out of breath.
But 2 years of this only strengthened his character and his determination to serve God. He became well known for his forthright sermons, and the Reformed Methodists helped him to leave the pawnbrokers and take up lay preaching.
The first day of my freedom was Good Friday. It was also my birthday. And third, and most important, I fell in love with the precious woman who afterwards became my wife.
Catherine Mumford has been described as a tender Puritan. She shared William's religious enthusiasm, and she fell deeply in love with him. For 2 more years he travelled as a preacher for the Methodist New Connection, and then in 1855 they planned to be married.
My dearest and precious Kate, I just write you a note to cheer your soul and comfort your heart. The conference at Sheffield resolved I be devoted to my present labour throughout the next year. I am to have £100 and my expenses. The matter seems providential. I am indulging fond hopes. I fear not but that we shall be happy, and I will try and be all you desire.
On June the 16th, they were married in the Stockwell New Chapel, and they remained one in heart and purpose and life for 35 years. Together, when Catherine's health allowed it, they conducted revivals in the chapels of the New Connection. William, now ordained a Methodist minister, was becoming an evangelist of outstanding powers, but he soon found himself needlessly restricted in his work. Catherine stood by him, and together they left the organized church and led independent revivals from Cornwall to the north of England. This meant poverty and hardship. They had no home. They spoke in tents and the open air, for the chapels were closed against them. For Catherine, all this was while she brought up a young family, of whom Bramwell was the eldest. For William it was often a time of illness and of acute depression, for they had no known future. But a way was open for them. In 1865, Catherine came back to London to lead a mission. What she saw of the Midnight Movement convinced her that they should work in London and outside the churches. As she said, we can't get at the masses in the chapels. In London, the same compassion for the poor that William had felt in Nottingham welled up again for the squalid misery of the East End crowds. There was charity for them, soup kitchens and Samaritan societies, but like others already at work there, William Booth wanted to reach men's souls.
I saw multitudes of my fellow creatures without God and without hope. I looked on the drunkenness and harlotry and pauperism and slumdom and blasphemy. As I passed by the doors of the flaming gin palaces, I seemed to hear a voice. Where can you find such heathen as these? Where is there so great a need for your labours?
London had taken possession of William Booth, as in later years he was to possess the heart of London. But a quarter of a century of struggle faced him and Catherine before their work would be established in the East End. The first half of this period, when the seeds were sown and the techniques developed for the Salvation Army, is the story of the East London Christian Mission, for which Booth preached on the Mile End Waste. The open air was always the starting point.
We found that the aversion of the working classes to churches and chapels was strong, yet they eagerly listened to the truths of the Bible in the open air. Then, as we passed along the spacious thoroughfare singing, the people ran from every direction, some in mockery, some in anger, and some turned and accompanied us. Every outdoor service was connected with an indoor meeting, where prayer could be offered and appeals could be made for an immediate closing with Christ.
The place for the indoor meeting was always a problem, but at last an old beer house called the Eastern Star was leased as a permanent headquarters. The use of a flag is significant, and also the notice that Booth was preaching on Sundays at the Effingham Theatre. A newspaper commented acidly, "Enormous audiences have been drawn to hear this gentleman's exordiums by the somewhat plagiaristic announcement of change of performance. The boxes and stalls are filled with an idle and dissolute set of characters." Of course, it was just this set of characters that Booth wanted, and he soon found out what to do with them.
My first idea was to get the people saved and send them to their churches. But they would not go. They were not wanted. And we wanted them ourselves to help in the business of saving others.
The missioners of 1867 were the first of an army of converts set to converting others. In the dress of the women is the first hint of a uniform, as also in the dress of Catherine Booth. While William was in the East End, she had been working in other parts of London. In 1870, because of his illness, it was she who preached at the opening of the new People's Mission Hall, and from now on she shared in the leadership of the mission. The next few years were all excitement and growth, with huge meetings and branches being set up in London and throughout the country. The revival work began to take on a distinctive character. Booth did not inaugurate the changes, but he inspired them. As General Superintendent, he was often known as the General. At Whitby it was announced, "The General is coming to review the Hallelujah Army." Booth did not invent that title, but by altering the printer's proof of the report of 1878, he gave the mission the name Salvation Army, and the conference of that year was called a War Congress. In the mission staff, the army was virtually in existence. All it had to do was to change into uniform. The uniforms were rather varied at first, but the spirit and the purpose of the pioneers was always the same. Then a young man blew a cornet at a meeting, and the army was on the march, with its flags and bands, and its general.
The Salvation Army. What a strange name. It is an army to carry salvation through the land, organized to liberate a captive world and to fight and overcome the enemies of God and man.
And it had to fight. For years it met with hostility, even from the police and the magistrates, and with murderous attacks from the mobs. But the Salvationists prayed for their enemies and went on converting them. Most of the organization was undertaken by the General's eldest son, Bramwell. He was his father's right hand, especially when they had to face the tragic illness and death of Catherine Booth, the mother of the army. When she died, in 1890, William Booth drove himself into new activities. His Darkest England scheme stimulated the army's social work and shamed and roused the whole country.
When in the streets of London the cab horse trips and falls, there's no debating how he came to stumble. First of all, you have to pick him up again. When he is down, he is helped up, and while he lives, he has food, shelter, and work. Can even this standard, the cab horse standard, be gained for human beings? I answer yes. For the lost, for the outcast, for the disinherited, I propose to go straight for these. And if I do not save the fathers, I shall make a better chance for their children.
Booth's own children and his grandchildren, following him into his work, were a great joy to him. Some of them still remember him. Among them, his eldest granddaughter, Commissioner Catherine Bramwell Booth.
I don't remember him before he was in his 60s, so he seemed an old man to us, and yet he didn't seem a bit dull. He was so full of eagerness about everything. Of course, my grandfather was a man full of surprises. He'd suddenly say in the middle of tea, "Now then, let's have testimonies. Catherine, you give your testimony." It was rather awe-inspiring then for a small girl. However, we loved him very much, and especially we thought so much about him because of my father's attitude. I can remember now, see a picture of them almost as if they were present to my mind's eye. Father and the General talking together so eagerly, bursting out into laughter. William Booth used to throw his head back and roar with laughter. Then all of a sudden the General would look round and say, "Children, now we'll pray." Sometimes about the very thing they'd been discussing, sometimes about us and whether we were as good as we ought to be, and so on. Oh, he never put on a praying voice. No, never. It was the same. And it brought God very near to us, you know, that kind of praying. When I was a captain at my first post, officer commanding Bath, the General, my grandfather, came to hold a weekend's meetings and had a magnificent Sunday in the theatre, crowds and a great number of penitents, and then on the Monday morning the motor cavalcade set off, and I was with him. Of course, in those days the cars were open, there was no shelter, And I think only those who travelled in them could imagine what it was like to taste the dust, smell the dust. Your eyes were full of dust. I can see his face now, a little drawn, and he didn't talk to me much. But the moment we saw the first group of people, it was as though the man were changed, almost as if he might have wakened out of a sleep. That's the most vivid recollection I have, really, of that couple of days with him, and the people's tears, and the love shining in their faces. It was a thing one could never forget. Although, of course, when he was preaching, he was terrific, I think would be the word. I've often heard him as a girl preach. Tremendous preacher. He preached about the most solemn things. Those were all living truths with him.
This is the earliest film of a Salvation Army meeting, made about 60 years ago. The army, of which Commissioner Catherine was then a young officer, still used its original method of witnessing in the open air. But by now it was a huge international movement, established in 36 countries overseas. A hall had to be specially built in the Strand, where Australia House is now, to hold the thousands of delegates who came to the International Congress of 1904. The General himself was now a famous figure. In these last years, though still criticized, he was widely loved. He toured the world. He was received by kings. But as he took the salute at the Crystal Palace, nothing could give him greater joy than to know that the work of his army was acknowledged and respected everywhere. 4 months before he died in 1912, he spoke for the last time in the Albert Hall, at the celebration of his 83rd birthday. Though these are not the words he used on that occasion, this is the authentic voice of William Booth.
All around you on the waste waters of life, in their poverties, miseries and sins, the people are sinking. Will you help them? If neither money, pride or self bar the way overboard with it, put your trust in God, throw your arms round the perishing, and swim until by and by, when the kindly hand of death lands you on the golden shore, the Spirit whom you have saved shall bear you away on their snowy wings to the feet of your Lord, and say, this is the man, this is the woman who saved me.
His leadership has been carried on by a succession of 6 generals. The first was his eldest son, Bramwell, the Chief of Staff in William's lifetime. His last public appearance was at the foundation of the Memorial Training College. The general from 1946 to 54, General Albert Osborne, knew William Booth well.
And I should say, first of all, the thing that impressed me most about him was that he was a forward-looking man. He was not content to leave things just exactly as he found them. And if one were to ask me, is that same spirit in the Salvation Army today? I should say most definitely yes. The young people of the Salvation Army today, they have the same spirit. And I believe that if a revival of religion is to come to this country, it will come from the under-30s. And in that revival, the young people of the Salvation Army will definitely play a part, because they are prepared to do the unconventional. He loved people. When I was a boy at International Headquarters, the founder came down in the lift one night, and I pulled the door open to let him go out to his cab, hoping that he would pass me by. Nothing of the kind. The founder stopped and looked at me and said in a voice that rather frightened that office boy, "Who are you?" And I said, "I am Osborne, sir." He said, "Are you the son of Major Osborne?" I said, "Yes, sir." And then he said, "Are you a good boy?" Well, of course, I was a little hesitant in answering, but I said, "I'm trying to be good, sir." He said, "That's no good. You must be good." but I never forgot that he cared about an office boy. And later on I learned that he cared very deeply about people. I was on duty at the Clapton Congress Hall in 1912 at the lying in state of William Booth. And I saw thousands of people filing past and taking a last look at the old general. But I should think the thing that most impressed me was the remark of an obviously poor woman, probably from the slums of the East End of London, who said, as she looked at him, "He was a wonderful man. He cared for the likes of us."
You see, he was really in love with people, and to make people good. He believed that God was able to recreate in man the original design, and however low or besotted or degraded a person might be, that person could be restored to the likeness of God. He despaired of no one. No one was too bad. Go for souls and go for the worst. That was one of the things that he constantly said to officers. And he lived up to it himself. He lived up to it himself.